Vincent Coleman never planned to become a subject of anyone's scrutiny. His days followed a rhythm older than most things in his quiet neighborhood. Sunrise coffee, the measured hum of stone-cutting tools, the scent of limestone dust that clung to his clothes like an inheritance. He wasn't a man who sought conflict. He sought permanence, solidity, things that didn't crack when someone raised their voice. When he started building the garage at the far end of his property, it wasn't about expansion or showing off. It was a promise to himself, a space where he could preserve the tools and sketches passed down from his father, where craft and memory would merge into something steady. The land had belonged to his family for 3 generations, and in his mind, that made it sacred, even if no one else saw it that way. The garage rose slowly, stone by stone, each block cut by Vincent's own hands. The neighbors often watched from their balconies, some admiring the dedication, others frowning at the sight of a man working without contractors or permits flashing on a signpost. Among them was Karen Montgomery, the owner of a gleaming mansion next door that looked like it had been designed for magazine spreads rather than human life. Her house shimmered white under the afternoon sun, glass walls reflecting every movement around it. From her terrace, she could see the entire stretch of Vincent's property, and she often did, standing there with a cup of herbal tea that seemed more like a prop than a drink. At first, her curiosity was harmless. She asked about the stone type, about the noise, about how long he expected the project to take. Vincent, who disliked unnecessary conversation, gave her polite but short answers. Yet as the structure took shape, her tone shifted. She started making remarks that lingered in the air like warnings disguised as pleasantries. You know, sometimes old property lines are off by a few feet. Or, I heard the surveyor the county used back in the 70s wasn't exactly reliable. Vincent would nod without engaging, thinking she just wanted to sound knowledgeable. But then one afternoon, she came closer. Too close. He was fitting the upper stone lintel above the garage doors when he heard her heels clicking over the gravel. Karen stood by the half-built wall, wearing sunglasses that hid her eyes, but not her expression. "You might want to stop there," she said, her voice smooth but edged. "That wall crosses the boundary. I've already checked." Vincent set down his trowel and looked at her, confused. "That's impossible. The old map's right there, and I measured from the fence post." Karen smiled, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that came before paperwork. "Well, I've asked for a new survey. I have friends at the planning board. They'll see the situation clearly. If I were you, I wouldn't keep building until they confirm." Her words weren't shouted, but they carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. Vincent, unwilling to let irritation surface, simply replied, "You're welcome to check whatever you like." But the rest of the day, he worked in silence heavier than usual. The rhythm of his tools felt uncertain, like the land itself had started to question him. That night, as he walked across the yard, the moonlight fell on the clean lines of the new stone wall. It looked solid, immovable. Yet a faint unease gnawed at him, an old instinct that something was being set in motion beyond his control. The next morning, when he stepped outside, Karen was already on her balcony, phone in hand, taking photos of the construction site below. For a moment their eyes met, though hers were hidden behind the dark glass. She lifted her cup in a mock toast, then turned away. Vincent stood there, dust on his hands, heart steady but cold. He didn't know it yet, but that casual gesture marked the last day his work, and his peace, would belong only to him. The notice came on a Thursday morning, folded neatly in an envelope stamped with the county seal and tucked into Vincent's mailbox like any other piece of mail. For a few seconds, he thought it might be a tax statement or another routine reminder from the utilities office. But when he tore it open, a sharp sense of wrongness filled the air. The letterhead read, Planning and Zoning Department, Notice of Construction Suspension, and beneath it, in small bureaucratic language that seemed to smirk between the lines, was the statement that his garage project had been placed under review following a formal complaint regarding boundary violations. Vincent read it twice, slowly, trying to make sense of the phrasing. There was no name listed for the complainant, but he didn't need one. The echo of Karen's voice, calm, polite, almost rehearsed, replayed in his mind like a recording. I have friends at the board. They'll see the situation clearly. He placed the letter on the workbench and stood in silence. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain, and the unfinished garage loomed like a half-built promise. The suspension meant he couldn't continue the work legally, not until the inspection was complete. He tried calling the number on the letter, but after 3 transfers and 10 minutes of hold music, the line disconnected. By the time he called again, the office had closed for the day. He could already feel how the system was built. Delays, confusion, polite stone walls that drained your patience until you gave up. But Vincent didn't give up easily. That evening he pulled out the original plat maps, the survey notes his grandfather had scrawled decades ago, and the faded copy of the deed that clearly defined the property's limits. Every measurement aligned. His garage stood entirely within his land. The line that Karen claimed he'd crossed wasn't just false, it was impossible. The next morning he decided to hire a professional surveyor to confirm it beyond any doubt. The man he found, an older specialist named Douglas Finch, had a reputation for precision and for not caring about neighborhood politics. When he arrived, he spent hours marking reference points and rechecking old coordinates with modern equipment. Vincent watched quietly, his arms folded, as the orange flags began to appear across the gravel and grass. When Douglas finally finished, he rolled up his equipment and gave a small, grim smile. "Well," he said, "you're in the clear. No question about it. Every inch of that structure is yours. But your neighbor—" He hesitated, then pointed toward Karen's sprawling mansion. "She's got a problem she probably doesn't know about. Or maybe she does." Vincent frowned. Douglas unrolled his tablet, showing him the satellite overlay. Her southern patio? Half of it sits outside her recorded lot. Look here, that's state land, technically part of the protected park perimeter. He zoomed in. Either someone messed up big time, or that house was built after someone looked the other way. Vincent's throat went dry. The revelation hit like a shift in gravity. It wasn't just that Karen's accusation was false. Her entire property line was compromised. "Can you document this?" he asked. Douglas nodded. "I can, but I'll need to file it officially. Once it's on record, it won't just be her problem. The county will get involved." Vincent told him to proceed. For the first time in days, he felt something close to balance returning. Not victory, but truth. Yet beneath that clarity was a shadow of caution. People like Karen didn't make threats blindly. She was connected, and connections didn't fall quietly when exposed. That night, the sound of rain against the windows was relentless. Vincent sat by the garage entrance, watching the drops streak down the unfinished stone, listening to the steady rhythm of water hitting the tarps. He thought of his father's voice. Patient, pragmatic. When someone questions your line, they're not after the land. They're testing how far they can push you. He hadn't understood that wisdom until now. Around midnight, headlights swept briefly across his driveway and vanished. He looked out, but the street was empty. Maybe someone turning around. Maybe not. He didn't sleep. 2 days later, a second envelope arrived. This one wasn't from the county. The return address was a private law firm with a logo embossed in silver ink. Inside was a formal letter. "Our client, Mrs. Karen Montgomery, hereby demands immediate cessation of all construction activities and removal of the encroaching structure within 15 days, or civil proceedings will be initiated." It was signed by an attorney whose name Vincent recognized from local real estate disputes. The letter referenced specific parcel numbers, but when Vincent cross-checked them, they were wrong, slightly altered, as if copied from an outdated record. He couldn't tell if it was a clerical error or deliberate manipulation, but the message was clear. Karen wasn't waiting for the county's verdict. She was drawing her own line, one she expected him to step back from. Later that afternoon, Douglas called. His tone was low, uneasy. "Vincent, I filed that report yesterday. Someone's already pulled it from the system. I got a notification. Access restricted pending verification." Vincent felt the air tighten around him. "How can they restrict a public record?" Douglas exhaled. "They can't, legally. But if a request comes from the right office, it gets temporarily hidden. That only happens when someone upstairs wants to slow things down." There was a pause. "You need to be careful who you talk to about this. The overlap between her property and the parkland isn't small. If this blows open, it's going to make noise." Vincent walked outside after the call, staring at the horizon where Karen's mansion stood gleaming like something surgically implanted into the landscape. The sun was setting behind it, staining the sky orange and violet, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the reflection of her house mirrored in the puddles near his foundation, distorted, bending at the edges. He imagined the ground itself rejecting her ownership, the way stone sometimes spat out poorly set mortar. For the first time, anger found its place inside him, not loud or explosive, but cold and steady, like pressure behind glass. That night, a single page was slid under his workshop door. It wasn't typed, only scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Stop before you lose more than a wall." No name, no signature, just those words, and a faint trace of perfume that reminded him of Karen's balcony evenings. He burned the note without reading it twice, watching the paper curl and vanish in the flame. But the next morning, when he stepped out to the construction site, his measuring tape lay coiled in the mud, cut cleanly in half. He looked toward her house. The curtains on the second floor shifted slightly, just enough to make him wonder whether she was still watching, waiting for him to cross another invisible line. The silence around Vincent's property began to feel manufactured, as if the air itself had been warned to keep quiet. Days passed with no new letters from the county, no word from Douglas, and no visible sign of Karen beyond the faint shimmer of her car leaving the driveway each morning. But the absence of noise didn't bring peace. It created an emptiness that hummed with threat. He noticed little things first. A stack of bricks near the garage shifted overnight, muddy footprints leading nowhere, the faint click of a camera shutter one evening when he stepped outside after dark. He told himself it was imagination, the mind filling in blanks left by tension, but that illusion crumbled the morning he found a new set of surveyor's flags on his lawn, bright orange and freshly placed, marking a line that cut directly through the foundation of his garage. Someone had been there during the night. The markings were professional. Precise distances, labeled points, all tagged with an identification code belonging to a local land assessment company. Vincent called the number printed on one of the tags and asked who had authorized the work. The voice on the other end hesitated before replying that the request had come from a private client. When he pressed for a name, the representative grew cautious and said, "We can't disclose that, sir." He hung up before his anger bled through the line. That afternoon, he took the flags down one by one, snapping them in half and throwing them into a bucket by the wall. It didn't change anything, but it gave his hands something to do, and sometimes that was enough to keep the fear from showing. 2 evenings later, while locking the workshop, Vincent noticed the smell of gasoline. It was faint, carried on the breeze, but distinct. He followed it to the side of the garage where a dark stain spread across the ground near the stone base. The can itself lay tipped over a few feet away, empty. The match never came. Whoever had done it had stopped short, perhaps interrupted, perhaps only sending a message. The police arrived after his call, but left soon after taking a few photos, their indifference palpable. "Probably kids," one of them said, glancing toward the mansion next door. "Rich neighborhoods get bored sometimes." When Vincent asked about fingerprints, they shrugged. "Doubt you'll find anything useful." The next morning, A thick envelope appeared on his doorstep. Another letter from the law firm, this one more aggressive. It accused him of tampering with verified survey data and warned that unauthorized removal of boundary markers may result in litigation. The language was clinical, but the intention clear. They were documenting everything, constructing a paper trail meant to bury him in procedure. Vincent read the letter while sitting on the unfinished stone step, the words dulling into background noise. The more he stared at the page, the more he realized that it wasn't about truth anymore. It was about exhaustion, making him so tired that he'd eventually surrender. That evening he walked to Karen's gate, the gravel crunching under his boots, and called her name. For a moment, the only response was the faint hum of cicadas. Then, from behind the tinted glass of her front door, she appeared, poised, expressionless, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of her chandelier. "You need to tell your people to stop coming onto my property," he said evenly. "If you have a problem, bring it to me directly." She opened the door halfway, resting one manicured hand on the frame. "I don't know what you're talking about, Vincent. I'm simply following the law. Maybe you should do the same." Her tone was polite, almost soothing, but her eyes didn't match the smile. "You've been busy," she added, glancing past him toward the garage. "It's a shame, really. It was starting to look nice." Then she closed the door without waiting for a reply. That night, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The floodlights he'd installed months ago flickered twice before going dark, though the power in the house stayed on. He stepped outside with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard, and caught a glimpse of something small and metallic glinting near the fence. It was a drone, hovering low and silent, its red sensor light blinking faintly. He threw a stone, hitting it squarely, and it toppled into the grass with a soft whine. When he picked it up, there was no brand name, only a number etched into the casing, M9307. He knew what it meant. Surveyor grade. Someone was mapping his property again. The next day, Douglas finally called back. His voice was strained, like someone speaking through clenched teeth. "Vincent, listen. I was asked to retract my report." "By who?" "They didn't say directly, but the request came through the same department where Karen's husband used to work before he retired. They're calling it a potential data discrepancy." Vincent exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. "That's impossible. You know the numbers are right." Douglas lowered his voice. "I do, but this isn't about numbers anymore. They're trying to erase the record that puts her house over the park boundary. You're not dealing with a neighbor. You're dealing with leverage." After the call, Vincent drove out to the edge of the property line that bordered the state park. The terrain dipped slightly there, a stretch of scrub and old fencing where the grass grew taller and the soil felt damp beneath his boots. He crouched and studied the markers Douglas had left weeks earlier, small metal stakes, still intact, the last honest evidence of where the line truly ran. Beyond them, he could see the shadow of Karen's patio extending unnaturally far, her decorative stonework bleeding into the untouched green of public land. For a long moment he just stood there, listening to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about truth being rewritten in real time, one erased document at a time. That evening, when he returned home, something glimmered on his doorstep under the porch light, a single construction nail driven into a folded piece of paper. The note read, "Boundaries can shift. People should too." No signature, no handwriting he recognized, but the nail itself was identical to the ones he used on his roof beams. She was sending pieces of his own work back to him as warnings. Vincent tore the note, pocketed the nail, and went to his workshop. He didn't sleep that night. He sharpened his tools instead, one by one, until the sound of steel against stone drowned out the quiet entirely. By the time autumn arrived, the tension around Vincent's property had turned into something almost ritualistic, a slow tightening of invisible threads that seemed to draw the land itself inward. The air grew colder, sharper, filled with the dry scent of stone dust and burnt leaves, and each morning the sunlight cut through the fog in pale ribbons that made everything look older, like a photograph fading at the edges. The garage still stood unfinished, a skeleton of limestone and steel ribs that waited for its roof, and yet Vincent could no longer bring himself to touch it. Every time he tried to resume work, another obstacle appeared. An official notice pinned to his gate, a call from the zoning office requesting clarification, or worse, another small act of intrusion that reminded him someone was always one step ahead. It wasn't fear anymore. It was erosion, the kind that didn't break you suddenly, but wore you down with precision, as if measured by an unseen architect. One evening he drove to the county archives, a low concrete building that always smelled of damp paper and toner. The clerk recognized him. By now his presence had become routine. "Back again?" she said, offering a weary smile as she slid a stack of property files across the counter. Vincent thanked her and took the elevator down to the basement, where the old survey maps were kept. For hours he combed through dusty binders, tracing the boundaries that had defined his neighborhood long before Karen's mansion existed. The older the maps, the clearer the truth became. The southern edge of her property had never belonged to private ownership. It was designated as part of the Upper Creek Preservation Corridor, land that was supposed to remain undeveloped in perpetuity. But somewhere between the printed surveys of the early 2000s and the current cadastral database, a subtle change had occurred. A line had shifted, a few meters nudged westward, red ink bleeding quietly into beige. There was no visible record of who authorized it, only a series of initials in the margin. ALH. And a date that made his stomach tighten. The change had been made 8 years ago, right before the foundation of Karen's house was laid. He copied the files, scanned the marginalia, and left the archives just before closing. Outside, the night was clear and cold, the kind of clarity that made sounds travel farther than they should. His footsteps echoed along the sidewalk, and when he reached his truck, he noticed another vehicle parked a few spaces away. A sleek black sedan, engine off, windows tinted darker than regulation. He couldn't see anyone inside, but the interior light blinked faintly, like someone checking their phone. He stared for a moment, waiting for movement, then got in and drove home. The sedan didn't follow, but the feeling of being watched clung to him like static. The next morning he brought the copied documents to Douglas, who looked more tired than usual, dark circles shadowing his eyes. "You found the amendment," the surveyor said quietly as Vincent laid the papers on his desk. "I knew it had to exist somewhere. They call it a line correction, but in practice it's a legalized theft. That code, ALH, that's Alan Hartley, former deputy commissioner. Died 5 years ago in a boating accident. The man's signature shows up on half a dozen property shifts around the park's perimeter. Someone used him as a gateway." Douglas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You realize what you're holding, don't you? That line change isn't just about Karen's house. It could invalidate multiple developments along the creek. If this surfaces, it'll drag the entire county planning board into the mess." Vincent nodded slowly. "Then maybe it should." But Douglas shook his head. "You don't understand how deep this goes. The county can't admit an error of this scale, not when it implicates people still in office. They'll bury you before they let that happen." Vincent left without answering. The drive home felt longer than usual, every curve of the road carrying the weight of a question he hadn't yet asked himself. What if he was the only person who cared whether the truth survived? When he turned into his driveway, he saw something that made his chest tighten. His garage door was wide open, though he always kept it locked. Inside, the space was disturbingly orderly. Nothing was missing, but everything had been moved by precise degrees. The tools were realigned, the measuring tape rewound, the levels stacked. On the workbench lay a small rock sample he hadn't seen before, a piece of limestone, freshly cut, with a thin crack running through its center. Beneath it was a note, typed in clean mechanical font. Foundations fail when pressure is uneven. He stood there for a long time, reading it again and again until the words lost shape. Whoever had been there knew the language of his craft and had used it as mockery. That night, he decided to go back to the park boundary, taking with him a flashlight and the original survey documents. The forest behind the property was quiet, except for the occasional cry of night birds and the rustle of wind through the dry brush. When he reached the old fence, he knelt and examined the ground where the legal boundary should have run. The soil was disturbed. Someone had dug recently. A new metal stake gleamed faintly in the dirt, marked with an unfamiliar code, S215R. He traced the area with the flashlight and found that several more stakes had been placed, forming a straight line that cut across his property in a completely new direction. The message was unmistakable. Someone was rewriting the map physically, not just on paper. He pulled one of the stakes out of the ground and carried it home. By the next day, things had accelerated beyond any logic. A representative from the county's Environmental Compliance Office appeared unannounced, clipboard in hand, citing an anonymous report that Vincent's garage construction might be interfering with groundwater flow. The claim was absurd. There wasn't even a well within 100 feet of his foundation, but the man was insistent, asking to take photos and samples. Vincent refused entry without a warrant, and the inspector left with a thin smile, saying, "Then we'll return with authorization." When Vincent later called the office to verify the man's identity, no one by that name worked there. He wasn't sure which detail frightened him more, that someone had impersonated a government agent to intimidate him, or that the real office didn't seem surprised when he described what happened. That night, a storm rolled in from the coast, the kind that tore through trees and made power lines sway like rope. Vincent sat by the window watching lightning flash behind the clouds, turning the landscape into a strobe of fleeting silhouettes. In one of those flashes, he thought he saw movement by the fence, a figure standing still in the rain, facing his house. He grabbed the flashlight, ran outside, but when he reached the edge of the yard, the figure was gone, leaving only muddy footprints leading toward the park. The next flash of lightning illuminated something else, one of his own old survey markers driven into the mud with its metal head bent, as though someone had hammered it into the ground just to break it. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air cold and brittle. Vincent walked the property line again, noting how the ground felt spongy where the rain had pooled. When he reached the far corner, he noticed a scrap of reflective tape caught on a branch, the kind used on safety vests. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Someone had been working out there during the night, not wandering but measuring. He felt a strange calm then, a kind of resignation mixed with purpose. If they wanted to bury the truth, he would make sure it was impossible to hide. He would dig deeper, not just into the land, but into every record, every forgotten signature that had allowed this theft to exist. The fight was no longer about his garage. It was about reclaiming the reality beneath it. When dusk came again, he lit a single lamp in the garage and spread the documents across the stone floor. Lines, numbers, signatures. They all formed a lattice of deceit, a pattern that made sense only when seen as a whole. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Fear turned into a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. Somewhere beyond those trees, Karen's mansion stood on borrowed earth, and Vincent realized that before this was over, one of them would lose more than property. One of them would lose the ground they believed they owned. The days that followed were strangely still, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. Vincent worked quietly, barely leaving the property, aware that every motion could be watched or recorded. He could feel the tension bleeding through the ground, creeping under his walls, through the soil that had once felt solid and honest beneath his boots. The garage stood frozen in its half-finished state, like a monument to defiance, while across the fence, Karen's estate shimmered under the pale October light, all symmetry and silence. Yet at night, he could hear faint mechanical noises drifting from her side, the low hum of engines, the clatter of metal, the kind of sound you only hear when people are working outdoors long after the hour they should. It was as if the ground itself was being rearranged again, as if she was rewriting the earth 1 inch at a time. One morning, a letter arrived from the county's legal compliance office, stamped urgent. It informed Vincent that his property was now the subject of an environmental land use audit, triggered by potential structural interference with neighboring parcels. The language was vague, deliberately circular, but the implication was clear. The county was turning its attention toward him, not her. He knew the playbook now: overwhelm him with bureaucracy, drown him in inspections, create a paper shadow so dense it swallowed the real issue whole. When he called the number on the letter, the clerk on the other end claimed no such audit existed in their database. The letter was official in form, but invisible in record. Someone had created a phantom process to freeze him again. That evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, Vincent noticed a new vehicle parked near his driveway. It wasn't Karen's. It was a white pickup with a logo that read, L&M Construction Surveying. 2 men sat inside, their silhouettes unmoving. They didn't get out or approach the property, just sat there until full darkness fell, then drove off without headlights. When Vincent went to check the next morning, he found a small metal stake driven into the dirt near the road, another boundary marker, this one engraved with coordinates that didn't exist on any public map. It was a subtle invasion, a kind that blurred legal lines until ownership itself became a question of who wrote the last number. Later that week, Douglas came to see him in person for the first time since the storm. He looked pale and nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he handed Vincent a thin folder. "These are internal memos from a contact I have at the zoning department," he said quietly. "They show who's been pushing these audits. It's not just Karen. There's a consultant group attached to her husband's old firm, and they've been advising several property owners along this corridor. They're trying to consolidate the southern edge before the state renews the park protection contract next year. If they control the land before that, they can lobby to declassify it from the preservation list and open it for development." Vincent stared at the pages in disbelief. "So this was never about a wall," he said slowly. "No," Douglas replied. "It's about the creek. They want to build access roads and luxury villas along it. You're standing in the middle of their blueprint." That night, Vincent barely slept. The wind scraped against the roof, whispering through cracks like a voice repeating the same thought over and over. You were never supposed to notice. Around 3 a.m., a light flickered outside his window. He pulled back the curtain and saw 2 figures moving near the fence, small beams from their headlamps cutting through the dark. Without thinking, he grabbed the flashlight and stepped out. The air was cold enough to burn his throat. He moved silently through the yard until he was close enough to hear them speaking. Their voices were calm, professional, not vandals, not kids. "Measure from the new marker," one said. "We'll log it as adjusted perimeter." The other answered, "We can't do that without authorization." "We have it. Verbal." Then a pause. "From who?" The first voice laughed. "Does it matter?" Vincent shone the light directly at them. For a second they froze like animals caught mid-stride, eyes wide behind their visors. "This is private property," he said, voice level but sharp. "Leave the stakes where they are and get off my land." One of them raised a hand, trying to calm him. "Sir, we're just—" "Trespassing," Vincent interrupted. "That's what you're doing. Now move." They backed away slowly, murmuring something into their radios, and disappeared through the gap in the hedge. He followed their trail to the other side and saw a dark SUV idling there, its headlights off. The engine revved once, then the vehicle slipped away down the hill toward Karen's driveway. By dawn, he found what they had left behind, a thin tablet device half buried in the mud, its screen cracked but still blinking with GPS coordinates. He wiped it clean, scrolling through the data logs, and froze. The system wasn't mapping his property. It was scanning subsoil composition and foundation depth, as if preparing a geotechnical report. At the top of the screen, a single project title glowed faintly: Creek Expansion Phase 1, Montgomery Sector. That discovery changed something fundamental in him. Until that moment, he had been defending his home. Now he realized he had stumbled into the middle of a concealed acquisition campaign, something engineered with precision and influence far beyond one neighbor's pettiness. And yet Karen was still the visible face of it, the smiling facade shielding the machinery behind her walls. That evening, when he saw her outside watering her ornamental plants as if nothing existed beyond her perfect yard, he almost admired her composure. When she noticed him watching, she waved, her expression bright and unbothered, as though the entire world belonged to her. He turned and went back inside before the anger could take shape into something reckless. The next morning brought the breaking point. A black notice board was hammered into the ground at the edge of his driveway. It bore the county insignia and the words, "Public Right-of-Way Adjustment Pending Review." He stared at it for several minutes before realizing what it meant. They were about to reclassify part of his property as public land, the same tactic used to validate Karen's expansion years ago. It was the first step toward erasure, done in plain sight with bureaucratic indifference. He tore the sign down and left it by the gate, refusing to let it stand another hour. But when night came, he heard hammering again, the sound of metal striking wood, and when he went outside at dawn, the sign was back, identical and untouched, as if it had never been removed. Vincent stood there in the cold morning light, the mist curling around his boots, and realized that the line had been crossed completely now. The war was no longer about borders or papers. It was about who could shape reality faster, him with his truth, or them with their machinery. The difference was that he was done reacting. From that moment, he decided he would act first, whatever it took. The morning the confrontation finally came, the air was unnaturally still. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Vincent woke before sunrise, his mind heavy with the decision he'd made the night before. There was no plan, only clarity. A sharp, wordless understanding that things had reached their end. The sign at his gate still stood like a verdict, wet from the early dew, its letters half faded but legible enough to mock him. Public Right-of-Way Adjustment, Pending Review. He ran his hand along the edge of the metal, cold and slick beneath his fingers, then pushed it until it bent at the center, the post groaning like a hinge. The sound carried across the quiet street, and from somewhere beyond the hedge, a motion sensor light flickered to life. He knew she was watching. She always was. By the time the county officials arrived, escorted by a pair of uniformed deputies, Vincent was waiting at the garage. They came with polite smiles and crisp folders, each gesture rehearsed, each word wrapped in procedural calm. One of them, a tall man with wire-framed glasses, stepped forward and introduced himself as Mr. Lang from the Land Management Office. He began explaining that the inspection was a standard verification process prior to the adjustment of territorial access. But Vincent could hear the hollowness in his tone, the mechanical politeness of someone who already knew the outcome. "You're standing on private property," Vincent said quietly. "Mine. You'll need a court order to proceed." Lang smiled thinly, the kind of smile that belongs to people who believe they cannot be touched. "The order's in review. For now, we're here to verify that the boundary markers correspond to the most recent record." "The record you falsified?" Vincent replied. Lang's smile faltered for the first time. Before the conversation could go further, Karen appeared. She wasn't dressed like someone expecting confrontation. She looked immaculate, serene, her hair pinned in place, her voice calm as she greeted the officials. "Thank you for coming," she said, turning to Vincent with that same polite cruelty that had shadowed every interaction between them. "This doesn't have to be unpleasant. We're simply restoring what was meant to be." "You mean taking what you paid to have redrawn," he said. Her expression softened, as if she pitied him. "Oh, Vincent, you think too small. Do you know what this land is worth? The state will sell it to private development within 2 years. They'll call it progress, and you'll be the only man left standing in the way of it. You can't stop what's already been approved." Her voice carried no arrogance now, only certainty, as if she were describing weather, not theft. Vincent didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the small flash drive he'd kept hidden for weeks, a digital copy of the archived surveys, including the signed amendment logs and satellite overlays that proved the tampering. "You're wrong," he said softly. "You forgot to erase everything." For a brief instant, something flickered in Karen's eyes. Surprise, then calculation. "That data won't help you," she said. "It's inadmissible without authentication." "Then I'll make it public," he replied. "Let everyone see what your mansion stands on." Lang stepped forward, suddenly tense. "Mr. Coleman, I strongly advise you not to interfere with ongoing administrative matters. Dissemination of restricted data could be considered," but Vincent cut him off, his voice rising for the first time. "Restricted because it proves you're stealing land? Because it shows you buried state property under concrete and marble?" The deputies shifted uneasily, glancing between them. Lang tried to restore calm, but the tone had changed, the illusion of civility cracking under pressure. Karen turned toward the officials. "Gentlemen, I think this discussion is over. He's becoming unstable." Her words were precise, almost compassionate, like a doctor diagnosing a patient. Vincent laughed once, bitterly. "You're right," he said. "I'm done being stable." He walked toward the garage and pressed the remote switch inside. The old floodlights flared to life, washing the area in white brilliance. For a moment, everyone shielded their eyes. The beam fell directly on the new stakes that had been driven overnight, the false line glinting under the light like a scar carved into the soil. "There," Vincent said, pointing. "That's your proof. Those markers were placed illegally, and if anyone touches them again, I'll make sure this entire county knows who did it." Lang hesitated, then muttered something into his radio. The deputies exchanged quiet words, and within minutes, one of them received a call, a short exchange that ended with a simple nod. "Sir," he said to Lang, "they're pulling the team. There's an injunction order filed under Section 9. Until it's reviewed, we can't proceed." Lang's jaw tightened. Karen stared at them, bewildered. "That's impossible. Who filed it?" "Doesn't say," the deputy replied. "Came from higher up." She looked at Vincent then, truly looking, as if seeing him for the first time. He didn't smile, didn't move. He simply stood there, the flash drive still in his hand, the storm in his silence louder than any words. The officials left soon after, their vehicles rolling away down the wet road. Karen lingered at the gate, her composure cracking for the first time, her voice low and trembling. "You think you've won something," she said. "You've only delayed it. The land always changes hands, Vincent. People like you just live on borrowed soil." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Then maybe it's time the soil started choosing who deserves to stay." She turned away before he could say more, disappearing into the distance of her perfectly paved driveway. When the last sound of the engines faded, Vincent walked back to the garage and shut off the lights. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. For the first time in months, the ground beneath his feet felt steady again, as though the land itself had taken a side. Winter settled in quietly, wrapping the neighborhood in a stillness that made the last months feel like something distant, half-remembered. The grass along the fence turned pale, the air sharp enough to sting, and the sound of the creek beyond the park carried faintly through the cold. Vincent's garage now stood complete, solid, simple, unadorned, a thing built not for show, but for endurance. He spent long hours inside, polishing tools, fixing hinges, restoring what had been neglected during the fight. The rhythm of work had returned, and with it came something he hadn't felt in a long time, silence that belonged to him. Karen's house, once the centerpiece of the hill, had changed. The high glass windows were dark most nights, the lights inside fewer and dimmer. Rumor spread quietly that she had put the property up for sale, though no signs appeared at the gate. A few moving trucks came and went, their headlights cutting through the fog like brief flashes of memory. No one in the neighborhood saw her leave. The mansion remained, but its presence had dimmed, its reflection fading from the creek below, like a secret finally exhausted. Occasionally, Vincent still received letters from the county, follow-ups, notices, the aftershocks of bureaucracy cleaning up its own mess. But none of them carried threats, only acknowledgments. The injunction remained active. The parkland boundary was reinstated, and the adjustment project quietly dissolved without public explanation. It was victory, though it felt less like triumph and more like a correction, something restored to the shape it should have always had. One afternoon, as snow began to fall, Vincent walked to the edge of his property where the old markers stood. The forest beyond was silent, the ground soft with frost. He knelt, brushed the snow from one of the stakes, and pressed it deeper into the soil until it held firm. Around him, the wind whispered through the bare trees, carrying the faint echo of water and stone. He thought of his father's words again, about boundaries, about how they were less about ownership and more about knowing where you stood when the world tried to move you. When he finally turned back toward the house, the light was fading, and the first thin layer of snow had begun to settle over the fresh-cut limestone walls. The garage looked timeless now, part of the landscape itself. Vincent paused at the door, resting his hand on the cold stone, and for the first time since everything began, he smiled. Not because he had won, but because the ground beneath him no longer felt borrowed.